The night Reverend Caleb Pruitt stood on Hannah Whitlock's porch and told her she had 3 days to get out, while her husband's grave was still fresh enough that frost hadn't set in proper, was the night something inside her went very quiet. Not peaceful quiet, the kind of quiet that lives just before a scream. He didn't knock. He just opened the door, walked into her kitchen like he owned it, and in a way, he believed he did, because the church held the deed now, didn't it? He set his hat on her table, folded his hands like he was about to say grace, and told her that arrangements had been made, that it would be easier for everyone if she didn't make a scene. Easier for everyone. Hannah stood there in her dead husband's house, with flowers still on her hands from the bread she'd been making, and she thought, what kind of man walks into a widow's grief and asks her to make things easier? If you've ever been told to disappear quietly, if you've ever had the door of your own life closed in your face by someone who smiled while they did it, then you already know exactly what Hannah felt standing in that kitchen. And if you've ever wondered what it takes to survive when every single person turns their back on you, stay with us, because this story is about to answer that question in a way you will not forget. Before we go further, if stories like this reach something deep in you, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss one. Drop your city and country in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. And if someone in your life needs to hear this, share it with them. Now, let's go back to that kitchen. Back to Hannah. Back to the night everything changed. The flour never made it into the bread. Hannah set the bowl down so carefully it barely made a sound, which was strange because the feeling crashing through her chest was anything but careful. Her hands were still white with flour when Reverend Pruitt kept talking, kept explaining in that measured tone of his how the congregation had voted, how it was the Christian thing to do to settle matters cleanly before spring made travel easier. He used the word settlement 4 times in 2 minutes. Hannah counted. Counting was the only thing keeping her standing. The house goes back to the church's land trust, he said, adjusting the cuff of his coat. Thomas understood that arrangement when he borrowed against it 3 years ago. I'm sorry you weren't made more aware of the particulars. Thomas. Her Thomas. Gone 11 weeks, and this man was already talking about him in the voice you use for accounting ledgers. He was sick, Hannah said. Her voice came out smaller than she intended. He borrowed that money for his medicine. Pruitt nodded like she'd said something politely beside the point. Yes, and the debt remains regardless of circumstances. You understand. She did not understand, or rather, she understood perfectly, and that was the problem. After he left, she sat at that table until the candle burned down to a stub and the kitchen went cold. She didn't cry. She'd been crying for 11 weeks, and somewhere in the last few days she'd simply run out, the way a well runs dry in drought. What was left wasn't numbness exactly. It was more like a very clear-eyed rage that she didn't know what to do with. The next morning, she tried the Hendersons on the north side of town. Margaret Henderson had been her closest neighbor for 6 years, had sat at this same table drinking coffee, had borrowed Hannah's good shears every spring without fail. Hannah stood at Margaret's door for a full 2 minutes after knocking, and she could hear movement inside. She could hear the scrape of a chair, the particular creak of the 3rd floorboard, and the door never opened. She tried the Abbotts after that. Clara Abbott came to the door at least, looked at Hannah with something that might have been guilt if it had been braver, and said that her husband felt it wouldn't be appropriate given the talk going around, and she was sorry, truly, but there is no word more brutal than but when someone uses it to end their compassion. What talk? Hannah asked. Clara looked at her shoes. Hannah already knew, of course. The talk had started almost before Thomas was in the ground. The talk was that Hannah had been seen speaking with the trading post owner, a man named Devin Marsh, more times than a married woman ought. The talk was that Thomas's illness had come on very suddenly. The talk was the kind that attaches itself to widows like burrs to wool, sticky, sharp, and nearly impossible to pull clean. It didn't matter that Devin Marsh was 62 years old and had sold Thomas his tobacco for a decade. It didn't matter that Thomas had been sick for 2 years before he died, slowly, in the way that broke Hannah's heart on an installment plan. None of that mattered. The talk had a shape now, and Hannah's name was inside it. She had maybe $40 saved in a tin under the floorboard of the bedroom. Money she'd made selling preserves the summer before. Money she'd kept private, not out of any secrecy, but because Thomas had told her a woman ought to have her own emergency money. And he'd been right, God rest him. He'd been so right. She had that tin and the clothes on her back, and 3 days before Reverend Pruitt's arrangement became official. The second night she slept on the pew in the church, because the irony of that apparently did not trouble anyone enough to stop it. The third day, a woman named Dorothea Greaves, who ran the boarding house on Mill Street and who Hannah had once thought of as at least a neutral party, told her that she had a policy against taking in persons whose situations were under community discussion. She said it just like that. Community discussion. Like Hannah was a zoning matter. It was 31 degrees. Hannah had calculated, based on her supplies and the weight of her coat, that she could survive 2 nights in the tool shed at the edge of the old Cartwright property before the cold became genuinely dangerous. After that, she wasn't entirely sure. She stood at the edge of town where the road stopped being a road and started being a suggestion, and she looked up at the ridge. Everyone knew about Silas Granger the way they knew about difficult weather, as a fact of the landscape that you worked around rather than engaged with. He'd been on that mountain for going on 7 years, trading his furs twice a season at the post, buying his provisions in quantities that made clear he did not plan to come back often, and otherwise conducting his life in a manner that the town had long since decided was suspicious by virtue of its self-sufficiency. Men who didn't need the community's approval were, in the community's opinion, probably up to something. Hannah had seen him twice. Once at the trading post, where he'd held the door for her without making a production of it. Once at the edge of the market, where he'd been looking at a map with the focused expression of a man who had somewhere to be and knew exactly how to get there. Both times he'd struck her as simply a person, not fearsome, not strange, just quiet in a way that suggested the quiet was a choice rather than a deficit. She thought about those 2 moments standing there at the edge of the road with her tin of $40 and her insufficient coat. Then she started walking up the ridge. The path was not maintained. That was the first thing. It was not a path so much as a series of decisions someone had made repeatedly, a line worn into the hillside by boots that knew where they were going. Hannah's boots were town boots, meant for packed dirt streets, and twice she went down on one knee in the snow before she learned to read the ground better. Her hands were numb by the time the cabin came into sight, which was longer than she'd expected. Silas lived further up than the talk suggested, tucked into a fold of the ridge where the trees gave some shelter from the wind. The cabin was, she noticed this and filed it somewhere, well made. Not fancy, not the rough desperation shelter she'd half imagined. The logs were fitted properly, the roof looked solid. There was a careful stack of split wood beside the door that spoke of a person who planned ahead. Smoke came from the chimney in a thin, steady line. She stood outside for a full minute, which was a long time to stand still in that cold, arguing with herself. The argument went, "This is a strange man on a mountain whom the whole town distrusts, and you are a woman alone." And then the counter-argument went, "The whole town distrusts you too, and you have been on your feet for 4 hours, and your fingers are going numb in a way that is starting to feel like a warning." She knocked. For a moment nothing happened, and she prepared herself for the specific humiliation of being turned away by a hermit, which would have been, she thought, a rather complete ending to the week. Then she heard a single set of footsteps, deliberate and unhurried, and the door opened. Silas Granger was taller than she remembered from the 2 glimpses she'd had of him. He had the kind of face that had been weathered into its final form by years of outdoor work. Not old exactly, somewhere in his mid-40s, with gray beginning at his temples and a beard that had been trimmed recently enough to suggest he still bothered. He looked at her the way she imagined he looked at weather, assessing, without panic, cataloging the relevant facts. She had prepared a speech. It had involved explaining her situation in organized terms, presenting herself as a reasonable proposition rather than a charity case, making clear that she expected nothing and would contribute what she could. She had worked on this speech for the last hour of the walk-up. What came out instead was, "I have nowhere to go and I'm very cold and I have $40 and I'm not what they're saying I am." Silas looked at her for a moment. Just a moment. Then he stepped back from the door. "I've got space by the fire," he said. And I don't care what people say. That was it. That was the whole speech on his end. Hannah walked inside and stood by the fire and felt the warmth hit her hands like small needles, which meant the feeling was coming back, which meant she was going to be all right. She stood there with her back to him for a little while, not because she was afraid, but because she needed a moment that was just for herself, just to absorb the fact that she was warm and inside, and that someone had opened a door. "Thank you," she said finally, when she trusted her voice. "Sit down," he said. "I'll get coffee." She sat. The chair was solid and real and faced the fire. Outside, the wind was picking up, throwing itself against the cabin walls in long, low gusts, and the snow that had been threatening all afternoon was finally starting to come down in earnest. Inside, the fire crackled. The coffee smelled like something she hadn't had in weeks. Silas moved around the cabin with the economy of a person who had been alone long enough to have worked out the exact arrangement of things. Hannah looked at her hands, still reddened from the cold, still shaking slightly. She thought about Margaret Henderson's door that wouldn't open. She thought about Clara Abbott's shoes. She thought about Reverend Pruitt's hands folded on her table like he was doing her a kindness. She thought, I have $40 and a cup of coffee and a fire and a chair, and somehow this is more than I had 3 hours ago. Silas set the coffee down beside her without ceremony. He didn't ask what had happened. He didn't ask why she'd come. He didn't offer her any of the complicated, performance-heavy sympathy she'd been getting from people who followed it immediately with a door in her face. He just made space. He sat in the other chair, across the fire, and picked up what appeared to be a piece of leather he'd been stitching, and went back to stitching it. The needle moved in and out with the same unhurried focus he applied to everything. After a while, Hannah said, I don't know how long I'd need to stay. No one ever does, he said. Not unkindly, just factually. I want to be clear that I'm not asking for charity. I can cook. I can mend things. I can be useful. He glanced up from the leather. I didn't ask you to prove anything. Which was, she realized, sitting with it, the most disorienting thing anyone had said to her in months. Because everyone had been asking her to prove something. Prove she hadn't done what the talk said she'd done. Prove she was worthy of a door opening. Prove she was appropriately broken up about Thomas, but not so broken up as to be inconvenient. Prove she was sorry enough, small enough, temporary enough. No one had simply not asked. She drank her coffee and watched the fire and listened to the wind outside and the small, steady sound of his needle moving through the leather. And something that had been coiled very tight in her chest for 11 weeks began, just slightly, just at the edges, to loosen. It scared her a little, that loosening. You get used to being braced. You forget that the bracing is costing you something until it stops. The snow was coming down hard now. Through the small window, she could see it erasing the path she'd walked up, filling in her footprints like they'd never existed. No one from town would come up here in this. No one would know she was here, and for tonight at least, that meant no one could do anything about it. She set her coffee cup down and looked at this stranger's cabin. At the organized shelves, the well-tended fire, the evidence of a life built carefully and on purpose in a place where no one else wanted to live, and she thought that there was something quietly remarkable about a person who built a good life specifically because he'd decided he was going to, regardless of what anyone thought about it. Maybe there was something to learn in that. My name is Hannah, she said, though he almost certainly knew it, given that she'd just told him she was the woman the whole town was talking about. I know, he said, without looking up. Silas. I know, she said. The fire shifted and settled. Outside, the blizzard made its long, cold argument against the walls. Inside, two people who had been decided against by the same community sat across a fire from each other and did not ask each other to be anything other than what they were. It was not a rescue exactly. It was more like breathing room. The first Hannah had had in a very long time. She didn't know yet what it would cost her. She didn't know yet what the town would make of the smoke rising from Silas Granger's chimney, carrying 2 people's worth of warmth. She didn't know yet what Reverend Pruitt would do when he heard, and he would hear, because towns like this one always heard. But that was tomorrow. and she had learned in the last 11 weeks to be very careful about spending today's surviving energy on tomorrow's problems. The needle moved through the leather, the fire held, the snow came down. Hannah Whitlock sat in a chair by a stranger's fire and was warm for the first time since her husband died, and she allowed herself, for just this one night, to stop bracing for the next blow. She would need that rest. What was coming would ask more of her than she knew she had. But that was the thing about human beings. You never quite know what you have until the moment that requires it arrives and finds you, somehow, still standing. She was still in the chair when morning came. Not because she'd slept there. She hadn't slept much at all, as it turned out, because the unfamiliarity of the cabin's sounds had kept pulling her back from the edge of sleep every time she got close. The fire settling, the wind finding new angles against the walls. The particular silence of a place where someone lived alone and had arranged everything around that fact. But she'd rested, which wasn't nothing, and when the gray light started coming through the small window, she was at least warm and in one piece, which was more than she'd been able to say with certainty the night before. Silas was already up. She heard him before she saw him. The careful, contained movement of a man who'd spent years not waking anyone because there'd never been anyone to wake, and who was now apparently trying to apply that same consideration in reverse. He was at the stove. The smell of coffee was already there. Hannah straightened in the chair and pulled her coat, which she'd kept on, out of some instinct she couldn't quite name, some feeling that keeping her coat on meant she could leave quickly if she needed to, tighter around her shoulders. "You don't have to be quiet on my account," she said. He glanced back. "Habit. How long have you been up?" "Few hours." He said it like it was nothing unusual, which she gathered it probably wasn't. She got up and folded the blanket he'd left on the arm of the chair. She didn't remember him putting it there, which meant he'd done it after she'd drifted off, which was a thing she decided not to think too hard about because it made her feel something complicated. She folded it twice, precisely, the way her mother had taught her, and set it on the chair arm. "I'd like to help with breakfast," she said. He started to say something that probably would have been some version of "you don't have to," and she stopped him before he got there. "I know I don't have to. I want to. I need something to do with my hands or I'm going to sit here and think too much, and that won't be good for either of us." He considered this for a moment, then moved aside from the stove. She found her way around a kitchen that wasn't hers with the specific, careful attention of a woman who understood that every kitchen had its own logic, and you had to learn it rather than impose your own. The flour was where she'd half expected it. The salt was not where she would have put it, but was where it was, and she adjusted. He had salt pork and dried beans and some cornmeal and 2 eggs that she treated with the reverence they deserved given what she had to work with. She made a cornbread in the pan that wasn't quite right. The pan ran hot on the left side, she discovered too late. But it was food and it was hot, and she set it on the table without apology. Silas sat down and ate without comment on the slightly burnt left edge, which she appreciated more than if he'd tried to tell her it was fine. That was the first morning. The second morning went a little smoother. She'd learned the stove. By the 4th day she had learned the stove, the particular way the door latch needed to be lifted slightly before it would catch. And the fact that Silas took his coffee without anything in it, but would not say so and would simply drink it wrong rather than ask. She put nothing in his coffee on the 4th morning, and he drank it without the small, almost undetectable tightening around his eyes that she now recognized as him compensating for sweetness he didn't want. "You should have just told me," she said. He looked up. "The coffee. You take it black." A pause. "I didn't want to seem particular." "You live alone on a mountain," Hannah said. "I think the ship has sailed on not seeming particular." It surprised him. She could see that, the way his expression recalibrated for just a second. And then, very quietly, he almost smiled. It wasn't much. It was the kind of almost smile that clearly didn't get a lot of exercise. But it was there. That was the first time she made him almost smile, and she registered it the way you register small victories when you've been losing for a while. He went out most mornings to check his trap lines, which ran further up the ridge than she'd walked. She learned not to offer to come. He wasn't exclusionary about it. He just needed that time in a way she recognized because she'd needed that kind of time herself, the kind where you're alone enough to hear yourself think. While he was gone, she cleaned and organized and made use of herself in every way she could, because usefulness felt right now like the closest thing she had to dignity. She mended 3 of his shirts. He had a 4th that needed it worse than the others, but she left it because there is a thing about mending someone's clothes, a certain intimacy to pushing a needle through the fabric they wear against their skin. And she was rationing that kind of intimacy carefully. She wasn't entirely sure why. She just knew it mattered. On the 6th day, he came back from the trap line with a rabbit and a look on his face that she'd already learned to read as him having seen or heard something that he was deciding whether to mention. "What?" she said. He hung the rabbit and took off his outer coat, and she waited. "Saw Greeley's boy on the lower path," he said finally. Greeley was the man who ran the mill on the south side of a town. She knew him by sight, a wide, florid man with a red face that got redder when he was annoyed, which was often. He wasn't hunting, he was just looking up at the ridge. Hannah turned back to what she was doing at the table. "Counting the smoke from the chimney," she said. "Probably." "How long do you think before someone decides to do something about it?" Silas was quiet for a moment. "In my experience, the doing something takes about twice as long as the talking. Talking's already started. So, couple of weeks, maybe." She'd thought it would be sooner. 2 weeks felt like a strange gift, but she'd take it. "Does that bother you?" she asked. "People talking about you?" He picked up the rabbit and started working on it with the clean efficiency of someone who'd done it thousands of times. "People have been talking about me since I put up this cabin. I'm still here." "What do they say? About you, I mean." "I've heard versions, but—" He didn't answer right away. She'd noticed he did this. He didn't fill silences the way most people did. Didn't rush to plug the quiet with words just because words were expected. He thought about what he was going to say, and then he said it, and sometimes that took a minute. "That I'm hiding something," he said eventually. "Depending on who you ask, it's either a crime or a woman or money that isn't mine. Sometimes all 3. "Is it any of those things?" He glanced at her, just once. "No." "Then why are you up here?" The rabbit, the knife, the fire, and then, "Because down there everybody wants you to be what they've decided you are. Up here, I get to be what I actually am." Hannah set down the spoon she'd been holding and looked at the wall for a moment. "What are you actually?" "Someone who's better at being alone than being misunderstood." She thought that was maybe the most precise description of a kind of person she'd ever heard, and she thought she might be that kind of person too, or becoming it, and she wasn't sure yet if that was a tragedy or just the truth. The second week, she started going outside with him in the mornings. Not to the trap lines, she still didn't offer that, but to split the smaller logs that he'd been stacking green, the ones that had cured enough over the fall that they'd take an axe now. She was not good at it the first morning. The axe was heavier than she'd expected, and she kept glancing off at the wrong angle, and she could feel him watching her without comment from where he was working on the far side of the stack, and the combination of incompetence and witness was deeply uncomfortable. She didn't stop. She adjusted her grip the way physics seemed to be suggesting she should, and tried again. And the third time the wood split clean and she felt something unlock in her shoulders that she'd been holding tight since November. "Better," Silas said from across the stack. "I wasn't asking," she said. "I know," he said. "I was just saying." The rhythm of the work did something good to her. She'd been a woman who worked hard her whole life, cooking, cleaning, helping Thomas with the accounts, when his eyes started going, tending the garden, doing the 1,000 small, unrecorded things that keep a household functional. But that work had always been in the service of something else, had always been threaded through with the awareness of other people's needs and other people's judgments. This was different. This was just wood and cold air and the satisfying crack of a clean split, and nobody watching it to decide what it meant about her character. On the 9th day, she cried. She'd been expecting it. The body keeps its own ledger, and she'd known she was carrying something that hadn't fully come out yet. It happened in the afternoon when Silas was outside, which was good because she'd wanted to do it without witness. She sat at the table and thought about Thomas. Not his death, not the illness, not the long, terrible last months, but a specific Tuesday morning 2 years before he got sick, When he'd come into the kitchen while she was making breakfast and put his hands on her shoulders from behind and said absolutely nothing, just stood there for a moment in the early light, and she had leaned back into him without turning around. A Tuesday. No occasion, just a Tuesday. She cried for about 15 minutes, which felt like approximately the right amount, and then she washed her face in the basin and went back to what she'd been doing. When Silas came in, he looked at her once, and she looked back, and he went to the stove and heated water without comment. He made tea. She hadn't known he had tea. It was in a tin at the back of a shelf, and set it in front of her. She hadn't asked. He hadn't explained. "Thank you," she said. "The birch on the east side of the line is starting to go," he said, sitting down across from her. "Might get another cord out of it if we take it before the snow comes back." She understood what he was doing. He was giving her somewhere to put her face while she collected herself, handing her ordinary practicalities the way you hand someone a handhold on a steep path. She took it gratefully. "Is it good burning wood?" she asked. "Burns hot, burns fast. Good for quick heat, not great for overnight. So we'd use it mornings." "That's what I was thinking." They talked about firewood for a while, and it was the kindest conversation she'd had in months. What she hadn't accounted for, what she'd been so focused on her own survival that she hadn't considered, was how the town would move from talking to acting, and how quickly once it started. It was Dorothea Greaves who came first, which had a specific cruel irony to it, given that she was the one who'd cited community discussion as her reason for not taking Hannah in. She came on a Thursday, which Hannah knew because she'd started keeping track of days again as a way of feeling like time was moving forward rather than just sitting in place. Silas saw her on the path. He'd been splitting that birch he'd mentioned, and he watched her come up without moving from where he was standing. Dorothea Greaves was a small woman with a large presence, the kind built over decades of being the person other people reported to. She stopped a respectful distance from Silas, which Hannah noticed from the window was a little further than she'd have needed to in ordinary courtesy. She was afraid of him, Hannah realized. Not dramatically afraid, just the low-level social fear of someone who'd built her entire sense of safety on community approval and was now standing outside the community's jurisdiction. Hannah stayed at the window and listened through the gap where the shutter didn't quite meet. "I've come to speak with Mrs. Whitlock," Dorothea said. "She's inside," Silas said. He didn't move. "I'd like to speak with her privately." "You're welcome to knock on the door," he said, and went back to splitting wood. There was a long pause that Hannah enjoyed perhaps more than was generous. Then Dorothea came to the door and knocked, and Hannah counted to 5 before she opened it, because some small satisfactions are worth taking. "Hannah." Dorothea looked past her at the interior of the cabin, the way people look at things they've decided to be scandalized by. "I came on behalf of the ladies' auxiliary." "Come in or don't," Hannah said. "The cold's getting in either way." Dorothea came in. She stood in the middle of the cabin with her hands folded and looked at the 2 chairs by the fire. Just the 2 chairs, nothing incriminating about 2 chairs, and composed her expression into something she probably thought was sympathetic. "We're concerned about you," she said. "You weren't concerned about me when I was standing on your porch," Hannah said. She hadn't planned to say it quite so directly, but there it was. Dorothea's expression flickered. "That was a difficult situation. We didn't feel we could—" "I know what you didn't feel you could do." Hannah kept her voice level, which cost her something. "What is it you want to say, Dorothea? There are people who feel, and I'm including Reverend Pruitt in this, who feel that your current arrangement is not appropriate, that it reflects badly both on you and on—" She glanced toward the window where Silas's axe sounds were continuing with absolute indifference. "On the community." "On the community," Hannah repeated. "You're a widow, an unattached woman, living alone with an unmarried man of unknown—" "He's not unknown. He's been living on this mountain for 7 years. Everybody knows exactly who he is. They just don't like that he doesn't ask for their approval." Dorothea pressed her lips together. "The Reverend has offered to arrange a room for you at the Gaddis farm. It would be more appropriate. If the Reverend wanted to arrange something appropriate, he could have done it before he handed my house back to the church's land trust."
Hannah's voice was still level. She was proud of that. You tell him I said thank you for his concern. And you tell him I'm warm and I'm fed and I'm fine, and I'll make my own arrangements in my own time. After Dorothea left, Hannah stood at the window and watched her pick her way back down the path, and Silas didn't look up from the wood until she was out of sight. Then he looked up at the window. Hannah shook her head slightly. He nodded and went back to the birch.
She thought that was a pretty good conversation for two people who'd known each other less than 2 weeks. The next pressure came from a different angle, and it was sharper. A man named Roy Tesler, who served as something between a deputy and an enforcer for Reverend Pruitt's particular vision of how the community ought to behave, came up the path on a Saturday with another man Hannah didn't recognize, and both of them had the quality of people who'd been sent to do something unpleasant and were working up to it. Silas met them outside. Hannah stayed inside but left the door slightly open. "We're here on behalf of community concerns," Tesler said. He was trying for a tone of official authority and almost making it work. "The situation with Mrs. Whitlock has been raised at 2 separate church meetings now. And she's not doing anything wrong," Silas said. "That's a matter of she's not doing anything wrong," Silas said again. Same tone, same volume. Not louder. Not more aggressive. Just again. Like he had all the time in the world to keep saying it. Tesler shifted his weight. "The Reverend has some concerns about the nature of the Reverend doesn't have any standing on my property." Silas said it the way you state a property line, plainly, without heat. "You're welcome to stand at the edge of it and have concerns, but you're not coming in. Mr. Granger, I'm trying to give you an opportunity to handle this quietly before it becomes..." "Before it becomes what?" The second man, the one Hannah didn't know, took half a step forward. He was larger than Tesler, there as a physical argument rather than a verbal one. Silas looked at him the way you look at weather, acknowledged, assessed, not panicked, before it becomes a community matter that requires more formal attention, Tesler finished. Silas was quiet for a moment. "You go back and tell Pruitt that if he has something official to say to me, he can come say it himself, and tell him to bring something in writing." He paused. "Tell him I said please." The please landed like a stone in still water. They left. They didn't look happy about it, but they left, and Hannah let out a breath she'd been holding since they came into view. When Silas came back inside, he looked at her, and something passed between them that didn't require words. A mutual recognition of the line that had just been drawn, and what drawing it was going to cost. "They'll be back," she said. "Probably." He went to the stove. "You want coffee?" "Silas." She waited until he looked at her. "I don't want to be the reason you have trouble. If you tell me it would be better if I..." "Hannah." He said her name for the first time, which was notable because he'd been careful with names, she'd noticed, careful about the intimacy of them. "Sit down." She sat. He poured 2 cups and set them on the table and sat down across from her, and he put his hands around his cup and looked at them for a moment before he spoke. "I know what I am to this town," he said. "I've known it for years. They've decided I'm whatever they need me to be when it's convenient, suspicious when they want someone to blame, useful when they need fur or a particular kind of work done. I stopped caring about it a long time ago." He looked up. "What I don't like is that they're going to do the same thing to you, and you haven't done a single thing to deserve it." "Neither have you," she said. He made a small sound that wasn't quite agreement and wasn't quite dismissal. "I chose this," he said. "I came up here specifically to be outside what they decide. You didn't choose any of this." "I chose to come up here," she said. "I knocked on your door. You had $40 and nowhere to sleep. I still chose." She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup the same way he'd wrapped his. "Silas, I'm not a stray you let in from the cold. I'm a person who made a decision. Let me own it." He looked at her for a long moment, the fire, the coffee. Outside, the wind, which had been building all afternoon towards something that felt like another storm. "All right," he said. "Good," she said. They drank their coffee, and the storm announced itself against the walls, and neither of them talked about Tesler or Pruitt or the town again that night, because some things you deal with when they arrive and not before. And tonight what was arriving was snow. She'd been there 3 weeks when she started to understand what kind of man he was, in a way that went beyond how he handled problems, or made coffee, or manage silences. It was the small things, the ones that didn't have an audience and therefore weren't performances. The way he checked the cabin's exterior every evening in a circuit that she realized, watching, was actually a maintenance inspection. He was looking for places where the wind was finding gaps, places where the structure needed attention. He did this every evening. He'd been doing it, she guessed, for years, just maintaining. Without being asked, without anyone noticing, just because it needed doing. The way he kept a small notebook that she wasn't supposed to see but saw once, accidentally, when it fell from a shelf, it was full of observations, weather patterns, and animal movements, and the dates of first and last frosts, written in handwriting that was unexpectedly careful for a man who worked with his hands. He'd been keeping records of the mountain the way a person keeps records of someone they love, trying to understand it, the way he had, tucked on a shelf behind some tin cups, a single book that was very old and had been read so many times the spine had given up. It was Thoreau, which surprised her, and she didn't say anything about it because some things are private and a person's relationship with a book is one of them. She was starting to understand that Silas Granger was not a man who'd been defeated by the world and retreated. He was a man who'd looked at what the world was offering and made a different calculation. She wasn't sure yet what to do with that. She was still, in so many ways, in the middle of her own calculation. But 3 weeks in, sitting in her chair by the fire, while he read something she couldn't see, and the snow made its case against the cabin walls, Hannah Whitlock realized that she had not thought about where she would go from here in several days. Not because the question had been answered, but because she'd stopped asking it quite so urgently. Because this, the fire, the coffee, the almost smile, the careful silence, the man who checked the walls every evening because they needed checking, this had started, very quietly, to feel like somewhere rather than just somewhere else. That was a new feeling. She was careful with it the way she'd been careful with the eggs, treating it with the reverence appropriate to something scarce and not entirely replaceable. Outside, the snow was coming down in the serious way that meant it intended to stay. Inside, the fire held its ground, and Hannah, without quite deciding to, put down the last of the bracing she'd been carrying since November and let the warmth in all the way. She didn't know yet that in 11 days the storm of the century would bury everything they'd built under 6 feet of snow and put a child's life in both their hands. She didn't know yet how much she was capable of when the moment required it. All she knew tonight was that the fire was warm and she was still here, and tomorrow she would wake up and make coffee and split wood and build another ordinary day out of the same materials as the last one. For a woman who'd had everything taken from her, ordinary had started to feel like the most valuable thing in the world. The 11 days passed the way good things sometimes do, faster than you'd want, and not without their friction. There had been another visit from Tesler, this one briefer and colder in the non-weather sense, in which he'd informed Silas that Reverend Pruitt had requested a formal meeting at the church hall and that Silas's non-attendance would be noted. Silas had said that Pruitt was welcome to note whatever he liked. Tesler had left with the tight-jawed expression of a man who knew he'd accomplished nothing but had to go back and report to someone who expected results. There had been a morning where Hannah had burned the cornmeal badly enough that the smell took hours to clear, and she'd stood at the window with her back to the room, feeling unreasonably furious at herself. And Silas had eaten the salvageable portion without comment, and then, after a while, had said only, "The stove runs hotter on Tuesdays. I don't know why. I've never figured it out." Which was almost certainly not true, but was the kind of thing you say when you're trying to give someone their dignity back without making a ceremony of it. There had been an evening where they'd actually talked, for 3 hours about things that had nothing to do with the town or the church or survival. About the specific difference between various kinds of winter silence, about whether animals understood seasons the way people did or just responded to them, about a bridge Hannah had seen once as a girl in Kentucky that had struck her as so beautiful it had made her feel, for the first time, that human beings might be capable of something genuinely lasting. Silas had listened to that last part with his full attention in the way he did things. Completely, without performing interest, just actually interested. And had said that he thought most beautiful things were accidents, that people aimed for something practical, and sometimes beauty happened alongside it, and Hannah had thought about that for days afterward. So that was the texture of the 11 days. small and real and imperfect, and building towards something that neither of them had named yet, because naming it felt like it might break it, and both of them had had enough breakage for one season. And then the sky changed. It happened the way serious weather always happens in the mountains. With a strange stillness first, a held breath quality to the air that the animals understood before the people did. Silas's two dogs, a mismatched pair, one gray and elderly, and the other young and stupid and devoted, who lived in a kennel behind the cabin, and whom Hannah had been slowly winning over with systematic offerings of bacon scraps, both went quiet on the morning of the 12th day, pressed together in the back of their shelter with the particular stillness of creatures that know something is coming. Silas looked at the sky for a long time that morning, standing at the door with his coffee, not saying anything. "How bad?" Hannah asked from behind him. "Bad," he said. "Just that." They spent the morning preparing with the focused efficiency of people who'd been forced, separately and together, to get very good at preparing. Hannah filled every container they had with water from the creek because she'd learned from him that creeks could freeze over fast and the ice took time to melt, and you didn't want to find out the hard way that you'd underestimated. Silas moved the firewood from the outdoor stack closest to the cabin into the small covered section along the east wall. Not all of it, there was too much, but enough for 3 days if they were careful. He checked the cabin structure one more time in his evening circuit way, but more thorough, more urgent. By noon, the sky had gone the color of a bruise, that particular yellow-gray that means business. The temperature had dropped 8 degrees since morning. The wind that had been absent all day came back all at once from the north, carrying ice crystals that weren't quite snow yet, but were working up to it. The first real snow came at 2 in the afternoon, and it was immediately clear that this was not an ordinary snowfall. It came sideways. It came from 3 directions at once, which should have been meteorologically impossible, but winter in the mountains makes its own rules. Within an hour, the path down to town was gone. Not buried exactly, just visually erased. The landmarks that Hannah had memorized over weeks, suddenly just white shapes in white air. They were inside, the fire built up high, when they heard the pounding on the door. Silas got there first. When he opened it, a man nearly fell through the doorway. Someone Hannah recognized after a second as Abel Marsh, Devin Marsh's younger brother, a man she knew slightly from the trading post. He was coated in snow to a degree that meant he'd been out in it for a while, and his face had the particular mottled red-white quality of skin that had been seriously cold. He grabbed the door frame. His breath came in ragged pulls. "My boy," he said. "My boy's out there." Silas took him by the arm and pulled him inside. "How long?" Since this morning, before it started. He went out to check We have a line of rabbit traps set along the lower creek. He does it every... Abel stopped, swallowed, started again. "He's 9. He knows the way. He's done it 100 times. But when it started coming down, I went out to find him, and I couldn't..." "Which part of the lower creek?" Silas said. His voice was completely steady in a way that Hannah recognized as deliberate, the same way she'd kept her voice level in front of Dorothea Greaves, except his steadiness was for Abel's benefit, to give the man something solid to hold on to. "He starts at the fork by the old birch stand, goes east." Silas turned and looked at Hannah, and she already had his outer coat in her hands because she'd taken it off the peg when Abel said, "My boy's out there," without thinking, without deciding, just moved. "You don't have to," he said. "You cannot cover the whole East Bank alone in this," she said. "You know that. Stop wasting time." He looked at her for one more second, and she could see him calculating and then stopping calculating because she was right, and he knew it. He took the coat. "You know where the spare rope is?" he said. "Second shelf, right side, behind the canvas." He almost said something. Instead, he got the rope. She got her own coat, the heavier blanket she'd been using as an outer layer, and the 2 pairs of wool gloves she'd made from scraps she'd found in his work basket 3 days ago because her hands had been a problem in the cold, and she'd needed to solve it. She gave him 1 pair without discussion. Abel tried to stand up from where he'd collapsed against the wall. "I'm coming." "You're not," Silas said. Not unkindly, but absolutely. You can barely stand. You'd be another problem out there. He looked at the man's hands, which were showing the white patches that meant the early stages of frostbite. Get those hands in warm water, not hot. Stay by the fire. If we're not back in 3 hours, the dogs know my scent. Open the kennel and let the gray one loose. Abel made a sound that was most of a word and none of a sentence. We'll find him, Hannah said. She said it because she needed Abel to believe it, and she needed herself to believe it, not because she was certain. She was not certain of anything except that a 9-year-old boy was somewhere in that white chaos, and she was not going to sit by a fire while someone looked for him. Outside, the storm hit her like a physical argument. The wind shoved and the snow came at her face horizontally, and she had to turn into it at an angle, leading with her shoulder to keep her feet under her. Silas was already moving, and she matched his pace, which was faster than she'd have managed alone. He read the ground through the snow in a way she couldn't yet, knew where the solid earth was and where the drifts were going to be soft, and she stayed in his exact footsteps when she could, and learned to read it herself when she couldn't. They didn't talk. There was no point in talking. The wind ate sound. The path down toward the lower creek took twice as long as it would have in ordinary conditions, and the ordinary conditions weren't easy. This was steep terrain with exposed roots that were now invisible under snow and ice-glazed rock faces that you didn't know were there until you were on them. Hannah went down hard on her left knee on a patch of ice about 20 minutes in, went all the way down, felt the impact ring up through her leg, and was back on her feet before Silas had completed the turn to check on her. He saw her upright and turned back. She was grateful he didn't stop. Her knee hurt. She filed it and kept moving. The birch stand Abel had mentioned was distinctive enough that they found it even through the storm, a cluster of white trunks that made their own pale light against the gray-white air around them, skeletal and bare and somehow navigable. Silas stopped at the edge of it and cupped his hands around his mouth and called the boy's name. Danny! Danny Marsh! The wind took the name and threw it sideways. No answer. He called again. Hannah called with him, adding her voice to his, and they stood listening through the howl of the storm for any sound underneath it. Nothing. Just the wind and the creak of birch branches, and somewhere below them the sound of the creek moving under a skin of ice that was thickening by the hour. East, Silas said, more to himself than to her. He was looking at the ground, at the snow surface, reading it like text. There. He pointed to a place where the snow had a slightly different quality, a faint depression that might have been footprints before the storm filled them most of the way in. She saw it too once he pointed. Small depressions, widely spaced in the way a child's steps would be if the child was hurrying. They followed them east along the bank. The creek was louder here, even through the ice. She could hear it running underneath, not frozen all the way through, which meant the ice was unreliable, which meant a 9-year-old boy who'd gone to check rabbit traps and gotten caught in a storm might have looked for shelter near the water and found, instead, the particular danger of ice that looked solid and wasn't. That thought moved through Hannah's mind, and she walked faster. The depressions in the snow ran out about 100 yards along the bank, filled in past tracking, and Silas stopped and turned his head slowly the way she'd seen him do when he was listening to the mountain. She did the same. She wasn't sure what she was listening for, only that he was listening for something specific and she should try. And then, underneath the wind, underneath the creak of the trees, underneath the run of the creek, she heard it. A sound so small it barely qualified as sound. A whimper. The kind a child makes when they've been crying for a long time and have run out of the energy for it, and what's left is just the echo. There, she said. Silas had already turned toward it. He was 10 yards down the bank, under the overhang of a fallen tree that had come to rest at an angle against the bank. A narrow shelter, barely more than a lean-to made by accident, but out of the direct wind. Danny Marsh was 9 years old and small for it, and he'd wedged himself into the driest corner of that accidental shelter and pulled his knees to his chest and was doing what children do when they've exhausted every other option, which is wait and hope that someone is coming. He looked up when Silas crouched in front of him. His face was tear-streaked and half-frozen, and his lips had gone a color that made Hannah's heart do something sharp and panicked, but his eyes focused, which was the thing that mattered most. "Hey," Silas said, quietly, like they were indoors. Your father sent us. I couldn't find the way back, Danny said. His voice was thin as paper. I tried, but it all looked the same. I know. We found you. Silas was already checking his hands, pulling off the child's mittens. They were wet, soaked through, useless, and wrapping both of the boy's hands in his own, rubbing friction into them. Can you feel your feet? They hurt, Danny said, which was the right answer. Pain meant blood moving. No pain would have been worse. Good. Hurting is good. He looked back at Hannah. She was already unwinding the blanket she'd worn as an outer layer. The wind hit her immediately without it, took a run at her like something that had been waiting for the opportunity, but she had the blanket around Danny in the next few seconds, wrapping him close and tight the way her instincts told her to before her reasoning even caught up. Can you walk? She asked him. I think so. He was trying to be brave. She could see the trying. You don't have to be sure, she said. Just try. Silas got him upright, and Danny's legs held, which was another piece of luck they hadn't wasted. He stood between them, Hannah on his left and Silas on his right, and they started back west along the bank. The return was harder in the way that return journeys through bad weather always are. Not because the terrain had changed, but because they had. She'd used something getting there, some resource she hadn't known she was spending, and now she was running on the colder reserves. Her left knee had stiffened in the time they'd spent at the creek, and it registered its objection every time she stepped on it, loudly and without any interest in her opinion. She breathed through it, set the leg down, moved the next one. Danny was walking but flagging. About halfway back to the birch stand, he made a small, stumbling step that meant his legs were going unreliable, and Silas picked him up without breaking stride. Not with any drama, just shifted the boy onto his back and kept moving, and Danny locked his arms around Silas's neck with the total commitment of a child who has just discovered that someone strong has him, and he can let go now. Hannah took the rope that Silas couldn't hold anymore and looped it around her own shoulder and kept pace. The birch stand reappeared through the storm, and she felt something release in her chest that she'd been holding since they left the cabin. The worst of the terrain was behind them now. The path up the ridge was still miserable. She went down on the same knee twice more, same ice patch she'd found going down. And the third time she stayed down for a moment longer than the first two times, her forehead almost touching the snow, just breathing. But it was manageable miserable rather than genuinely life-threatening miserable, which felt like a meaningful distinction. Silas stopped above her and shifted Danny to one arm with an effort that she could see cost him something. The boy wasn't enormous, but he wasn't nothing, and they'd been out there for almost an hour now. He reached his free hand down to her. She took it. He pulled. She came up out of the snow, and they were very close for a second, her face near his shoulder, Danny's cold, wet boot near her cheek, the wind trying to knock all three of them sideways. And she thought, in a strange, displaced way, that this was possibly the most honest moment she'd been part of in years. No performance, no social arithmetic, just three people in the cold trying to get back to warmth, holding on to each other because that was the only sensible thing to do. Then she got her feet under her and they moved. The cabin appeared through the snow as a shape first, darker than the white around it, its edges uncertain, and then as a solid thing with a light in the window. Abel had kept the fire up. She could see the light from 20 yards out, and it was the best thing she'd ever seen. Abel had the door open before they reached it. He made a sound when he saw Danny. Not words, just sound, and came out into the storm in his shirt sleeves without caring about the cold at all, the way a parent moves when they see their child. Silas transferred Danny into his father's arms, and Abel held him the way you hold something you thought you'd lost, pressed to his chest, both arms locked around him, his face in the boy's hair. Danny, for his part, let go of the bravery entirely and cried in the open way that children cry when the danger is over and someone safe has them, big heaving, grateful sobs that were honestly the best sound Hannah had heard in a long time. They got inside. Silas dealt with Danny's boots while Hannah got the blankets from the bed. Her bed, the one she'd been sleeping in, she pulled both blankets without thinking. And they got the boy warm by the fire in the systematic way that Silas knew and that Hannah learned by watching and helping, working on his hands and feet with careful attention, watching the color come back, watching the pain register in his face, which was the right response and not the wrong one. Abel kept touching his son's face. He couldn't seem to stop. He'd put his hand on Danny's cheek, or on his hair, or on his shoulder, and then he'd remember that they were trying to work, and he'd pull it back, and then a minute later, his hand would be back. Hannah didn't think less of him for it. She thought it was the most human thing she'd witnessed in months. "How did you find him?" Abel said, at some point during this. His voice was still unsteady. "She heard him," Silas said. Abel looked at Hannah. She looked back, uncomfortable with being looked at in this particular way because it was new. Not the suspicious looking or the judgment-assessing looking she'd gotten used to. This was the way a father looks at the person who found his child. "I just heard him," she said, because the alternatives felt too large. "She's being modest," Silas said, and it was the most words she'd heard him spend on her at one time. She walked that ridge in this storm on a bad knee, and she didn't stop. She had not told him about the knee. She wasn't sure when he'd noticed or what he'd observed in her movement that told him, but she realized it now, that he'd known since roughly 20 minutes into the walk out and hadn't said anything, because saying anything would have been an offer for her to stop, and she would not have stopped. And both of them knew that. The understanding of that passed through her quietly. He had read her. He had not asked her to be less than she was. Danny fell asleep by the fire with his head on Abel's leg, the sleep of total physical exhaustion that children can produce without any preamble. His color was good, his breathing was even. He was fine. He was going to be absolutely fine. The storm was still going outside, which meant Abel and Danny weren't going anywhere tonight, and Silas had taken that on board without anyone discussing it. There were more blankets in the chest, there was food enough, the cabin could hold 4 people if none of them thought too hard about the space. He was already doing the quiet math of it, rearranging without fuss. Abel sat with his son asleep on his leg and looked at Hannah for a long time before he said what he said. "My brother told me about you," he said finally, carefully. "Devin, what the town's been saying." He paused. "I want you to know. I never believed it. I should have said so before. I should have said so a long time before this." Hannah sat with that for a moment. She thought about all the people who'd said nothing when saying something would have cost them very little. She thought about Margaret Henderson's 3rd floorboard. She thought about Clara Abbott's shoes. "It would have been good to hear," she said. She kept the edge out of her voice mostly. "But you're saying it now." He nodded, looking at his sleeping boy. "I'm saying it now." Silas was at the stove. She could hear him moving, the particular rhythm of him making something. Coffee, probably, or maybe something with more substance, given that it was past supper time and they'd been running on adrenaline for 2 hours. She didn't look at him. She didn't need to. She knew he was listening, and she knew he'd have something to say about it later, when Abel and Danny were settled, in the quiet way he said things. Plainly and without setup, the kind of thing you keep carrying around with you for days. The fire held. The storm made its argument against the walls. Danny Marsh breathed in the even, peaceful way of a child who had been frightened and found, and was now in the only place that mattered, which was somewhere warm with his father's hand on his hair. Hannah's knee ached. Her hands still felt the cold in the bones of them, the deep cold that takes hours to leave. She was exhausted in a way that went past tired into something structural, the kind of tired that means you used everything you had. She didn't mind it. She didn't mind it at all. She thought about the $40 still in the tin on the cabin shelf where she'd put it that first night. She thought about Reverend Pruitt's folded hands on her kitchen table. She thought about the door that wouldn't open and the shoes that Clara Abbott had looked at instead of her face. And she thought about a 9-year-old boy wedged under a fallen tree with his knees pulled to his chest, waiting. She thought, "I found him. Whatever else is true about me right now, whatever the town is deciding I am, I went out in that storm and I found him." That was hers. Nobody could take that and put it in a land trust. Silas set a bowl down next to her without ceremony. Soup. Something he'd had simmering on the back of the stove before the storm came in, the way a man who reads weather plans ahead. She looked at the bowl and then up at him, and he was already moving away, because that was also how he did things, without lingering over gestures, without requiring acknowledgement. "Silas?" she said. He stopped. She didn't have words for what she meant exactly. She had the fire and the soup and her aching knee and Abel's hand in his son's hair and the white chaos outside and the fact that when she'd reached down her hand in the snow, he had taken it without any of the calculations people usually ran before they reached for someone. "Thank you," she said. It wasn't enough. It was also everything she had. He looked at her for a moment with that direct, unhurried attention he gave to things that mattered. "Eat your soup," he said. "It'll get cold." It was not a romantic thing to say. It was not a literary thing to say. It was the exact right thing to say, which was something she was coming to understand was his particular gift, finding the exact right thing and saying only that, and nothing extra. She ate her soup. Outside, the storm raged on, big and indifferent and vast, pressing against every wall of every shelter in the valley, testing every joint and seam and foundation. In the morning, it would be over, and the world would be white and quiet and remade, and news travels fast in small settlements, faster than weather. And people who had been making decisions about Hannah Whitlock based on talk would soon have to make them based on something else entirely. But that was morning. Tonight there was soup and fire and a sleeping child and a man across the room who had walked into a storm without hesitation because a boy was out there, and a woman who had followed him because she had decided somewhere on the path up from town 5 weeks ago that she was done shrinking herself to fit other people's comfort. Her knee ached. The fire held. The soup was hot. She was still here. The storm stopped sometime before dawn, the way big things sometimes end, without announcement, without ceremony, just a gradual quieting until the silence was complete and the world outside was a different world than the one that had existed the night before. Hannah woke before anyone else. She lay still for a moment, cataloging her body the way you do after something physical has asked a lot of it. The knee was worse, swollen enough that she could feel the fabric of her stocking tight against it, and her hands still carried that deep bone cold even under 2 blankets, and there was a general soreness across her shoulders and back that would need a few days to argue itself out. None of it was serious. All of it was the price of the previous afternoon, and she found she had no complaints about paying it. She got up carefully, trying not to wake Abel, who was asleep sitting up against the wall with Danny still curled against his side, both of them so deeply under that they hadn't moved since she'd last checked at midnight. The boy's color was good. She checked that first, the face, the lips, looking for the wrong colors that would mean last night's work hadn't been enough. He looked like a sleeping child. Just a sleeping child. She got the fire built back up quietly and put the coffee on, and while it heated, she went to the window. The snow was extraordinary. It had covered everything to a depth she couldn't quite measure from here. The woodpile had become a shape, a suggestion of a woodpile, and the kennel where the dogs were was visible only because of the sounds of life coming from it. The path down the ridge was simply gone. The trees held snow in their arms the way they do after the serious storms, weighted down and still, everything white and clean and improbably beautiful in the way that only comes right after destruction. She heard Silas get up behind her. She didn't turn around. She knew his sounds well enough now that she didn't need to look to know where he was in a room. He came and stood beside her at the window, coffee cup already in hand, which meant he'd moved quietly enough that she hadn't heard him pour it. "How deep?" she said. 3 feet at least in the open, more where it drifted. He looked at it for a moment. "Abel's going to need help getting the boy home. His hands were better last night, feet too." She paused. "He'll want to get back fast. His wife doesn't know where they are." "I know." He drank his coffee. "Path will be passable by mid-morning if I go out first and clear what I can." She looked at her knee and looked back out the window. He looked at her knee too, briefly, the same assessment he'd been making since last night, with the same lack of drama about it. "I can help," she said. "You can supervise from the door," he said. She started to argue, and he looked at her with the particular expression he had for when he was not going to move. Not hard, not unkind, just settled, like a rock that's been in a riverbed so long the water goes around it automatically. "Your knee won't hold a shovel on that slope," he said. That's just true. It was just true. She disliked it, and she sat down. Danny woke up an hour later, which was a whole separate thing. He woke up the way healthy children wake up after a fright, completely, all at once, eyes open, and immediately assessing his surroundings with the total pragmatism of someone who'd been scared enough yesterday that today felt purely like bonus. He looked at the cabin, at his father asleep against the wall, at Silas outside visible through the window with a shovel, at Hannah by the fire. "Good morning," she said. "Is it morning?" he said, as if verifying this was important. "It is." He thought about this. "My feet hurt." "That's good. That means they're fine." He looked at his feet in their socks with a philosophical expression. "Hurting isn't usually good." "Most of the time you're right," she said. "This is a special case." He accepted this with the flexibility of a child who has learned that adults occasionally operate by different rules. Then he looked at her more carefully. "You're the one who came and got me," he said. "Mr. Granger and I both came." Danny shook his head with the certainty of a 9-year-old in possession of the facts. "Pa told me last night." "He said you heard me. He said you were the one who heard." Hannah looked at the fire. "I just listened." "Most people don't listen that good," Danny said. And then Abel woke up and the conversation moved on. But she held that sentence somewhere in her chest for a long time afterward, because most people don't listen that good. And she thought there was something in that worth keeping. Abel and Danny left mid-morning with Silas walking them down the cleared section of the path, and then watching them make it the rest of the way to the tree line. Hannah watched from the cabin door, her coat on, leaning against the door frame to take weight off the knee, until they were out of sight. Abel had shaken her hand before he left, both of his hands around hers, and he hadn't said anything because what he would have needed to say was too large for words, and he seemed to know that. That handshake was going to matter more than she knew yet. Silas came back up the path with the shovel over his shoulder and snow in his beard, and that particular quality he had after physical effort in cold air, more present somehow, more solidly himself, as if the cold worked on him the way sleep works on other people, some necessary process of returning to form. "They'll make it fine from the tree line," he said, coming in. "I know," she said. He put the shovel away and took off his outer coat, and she watched him and thought about what Abel had said the night before. "I never believed it. I should have said so." And thought about how those words had moved through her, not healing exactly, too late for it to be healing, but something, an acknowledgement, a small correction to a record that had been wrong for months. She thought about what would happen now. Abel would get home. He would tell his wife. He would tell Devin, his brother, who ran the trading post, and who had been Thomas's friend. He would tell people the way people tell things when they've just come through something that mattered, quickly, and with all the important details, and with the particular emphasis that comes from having been frightened and then relieved. He would tell it the way it happened, with Silas going out into the storm and Hannah going with him, and both of them walking the lower ridge in near whiteout conditions to find a 9-year-old boy under a fallen tree. And the people who heard it would have to put that next to the story they'd been telling about Hannah Whitlock for 3 months. And at some point, she thought, the two stories couldn't occupy the same space. One of them would have to give. She was not naive enough to think this would be simple or clean or immediate. She'd lived long enough to know that people don't abandon comfortable narratives quickly, not even when the evidence argues against them. But she thought it would be a crack. She thought it might let in some light. She was right about it being a crack. She was wrong about how quickly it would work. Abel talked. He talked to his wife, who talked to her sister, who was married to a man on the town council. Abel talked to Devin at the trading post, and Devin, who had never believed the talk about Hannah because he'd known Thomas Whitlock for 20 years and knew the kind of woman Thomas would have married, told the next 4 customers who came in. Abel went to the church on Sunday, 2 days after the storm, not to worship, but because that was where people gathered, and he stood up in the middle of the service, which was apparently not done, and which cost him something in terms of social comfort because Abel Marsh was not a man who stood up in the middle of things. And he told the full story. All of it. The knock at his door, the 2 people who'd gone out into that storm, the child they'd found, the night in the cabin where Danny had slept safe and warm while the blizzard spent itself against the walls. She heard about this secondhand from Silas, who heard it from Devin when he came in for provisions 4 days after the storm. "He stood up in the service?" she said. "Right in the middle of Pruitt's sermon, apparently." Silas set the provisions on the table. Devon said Pruitt's face went a very specific color. She thought about Reverend Pruitt's folded hands on her kitchen table. She thought about it would be easier for everyone. "Good," she said, and meant it without apology. The first knock from town that wasn't hostile came on the 5th day after the storm. It was Margaret Henderson. Hannah saw who it was through the window and sat with that for a moment before she went to the door. Margaret Henderson, whose 3rd floorboard she'd heard creak on the day she'd stood outside for 2 minutes, and the door hadn't opened. She opened the door. Margaret looked different than Hannah remembered, or maybe not different, maybe just stripped of the protective coloring that social certainty gives people. She looked like a woman who had been thinking hard about something uncomfortable for several days and had run out of ways to avoid it. She was holding a covered dish. "I made a brisket," Margaret said. I thought you might—" She stopped. She looked at the dish. She looked at Hannah. "I didn't open the door," she said. "You knocked, and I heard you, and I didn't open it. I want you to know that I know that." Hannah looked at her for a long moment. She thought about what she wanted to say, which were several things and not all of them kind, and she thought about what was true, which was that Margaret Henderson had been afraid, and fear makes people into versions of themselves they don't always choose. She wasn't going to pretend it hadn't happened, but she also wasn't going to make this woman stand in the cold holding a brisket. "Come in," she said. Margaret came in and looked around the cabin with the same instinct Dorothea Greaves had shown, the reflex of examining someone's circumstances for meaning, but this time without the judgment in it, more like someone checking that a person they'd been worried about was actually all right. "You look better than I expected," Margaret said, and then looked like she wished she could take it back. "I'm not sure what you expected," Hannah said, setting the brisket on the table. It smelled good, real good. She registered this and felt simultaneously hungry and annoyed at herself for it. "I don't know, the talk made it sound—" Margaret stopped again. She was having a hard time, and Hannah could see the genuine difficulty of it and felt some sympathy in spite of herself. "The talk was wrong," Margaret said finally. "About Thomas, about you, about what kind of woman you are. I knew it was wrong, and I still—" She made a gesture that encompassed her own failure without quite naming it. "You were afraid of what people would say," Hannah said. "Yes. And now they're saying something different. So here you are." Margaret absorbed this. She didn't try to argue it or dress it up. "Yes," she said again. Hannah thought that was, at least, honest. She could work with honest. They had coffee. It was not a comfortable conversation. It was the kind of conversation that involves a lot of silences and several false starts, and at least one moment where both women looked at opposite walls simultaneously. But it was real, and it moved through necessary terrain, and by the end of it something had been established that was fragile and uncertain, and might grow into something or might not, but was better than the alternative. When Margaret left, she paused at the door. "For what it's worth," she said, "what you did for that boy, for Abel's boy." She shook her head slightly. "In that storm." "Silas did most of it," Hannah said. Margaret looked at her with an expression that said she knew exactly what Hannah was doing and she was going to say the rest of it anyway. "What you both did. It mattered. It's changing how people are thinking." After she left, Silas came in from outside. He'd been out giving them space, which she appreciated, and looked at the covered dish on the table and then at Hannah. "Brisket," she said. "From who?" "Margaret Henderson." He processed this. "The one who didn't open the door?" "Yes." "Huh," he said, which was his version of a complex emotional response. "She's not a bad person," Hannah said, and then corrected herself. "Or maybe she is a little bit, and she's trying to be less. I don't know yet." "That's most people," Silas said. She looked at him. "Including you?" He thought about this seriously, which was how he thought about everything. "I've got different failures," he said. "I stay away from people so I don't have to find out what I do in the moment when it was easier to be bad." "You found out," she said, "in the storm." He was quiet. "You didn't hesitate," she said. "Not for a second. You had your coat on before Abel finished explaining." That's different, he said. How? A child, he said. Like that was the complete answer, which maybe it was. She let it rest. She'd learned when to let things rest with him, which was one of the more useful things she'd learned in 6 weeks on this mountain. The second visit from town was Roy Tesler, which she had not anticipated. Not Tesler the enforcer on an errand from Pruitt, but Tesler the man alone, without the second man he'd brought last time for physical emphasis, on a Wednesday afternoon with his hat in his hands. He asked to speak with Silas specifically, which was unusual enough that Hannah stayed near the door where she could hear. I owe you an apology, Tesler said. She could hear the difficulty in it, the specific roughness of a man not practiced at apology working through it anyway. The way I came up here before, the way I spoke to you, I was following Pruitt's lead and I should have thought for myself. Silas was quiet long enough that Hannah wondered what he was doing. Then, what changed your mind? Abel Marsh, Tesler said. What he said at service and... A pause. My own daughter. She's 9. Same as the Marsh boy. I kept thinking about it. About what I'd want someone to do if it was her out there. What did Pruitt think of what Abel said? Silas asked. He's not happy. Tesler's voice was careful. He's framing it as, he's saying that good acts don't erase questionable circumstances. That whatever happened in the storm doesn't change the fundamental impropriety of, I know what he's saying, Silas said. I want you to know that not everyone agrees with him, more people than you might think. After Tesler left, Hannah came fully into the room and they looked at each other. Not everyone agrees with him, she repeated. Apparently. That's not the same as things being resolved, she said. No, he agreed. She sat down. Her knee was better. She'd been keeping off it, and it had responded reasonably. But she still favored it, would for another week probably. She looked at the fire and thought about Reverend Pruitt framing it, finding the language to make even this into evidence of her unworthiness. He's not going to stop, she said. Men like that don't stop, Silas said. They rearrange. So what do we do? He sat down in the other chair and looked at the fire the same way she was looking at it. This was something she'd come to value. The fact that when she asked a question, he treated it as a question, took it seriously, didn't rush to produce an answer just to fill the space. We keep doing what we're doing, he said finally. We don't hide. We don't apologize for being here. And we let people see what we actually are instead of what he says we are. That's a slow strategy, she said. Yes, he said, but it's the one that holds. She thought about that. She thought about all the things that hadn't held, Thomas's health, her house, the goodwill of neighbors she'd thought were solid. She thought about what had held, the fire, the work, this man's particular brand of quiet stubbornness, her own. All right, she said, the shift in town when it came wasn't a single moment. It was more like ice in spring. It doesn't go all at once, it goes in patches. This section letting loose and then that one. And for a while there's still more frozen than not, and then one day you look and it's mostly open water. The ice doesn't announce when it's done. You just notice one day that it is. Devin Marsh stopped being merely a voice in the background and started being an active one. He was at the trading post every day talking to every person who came through, and he had a particular advantage that Pruitt didn't have, which was that everyone owed him a little goodwill from years of fair dealing, and he spent it deliberately. Not loudly, just consistently, mentioning what he knew of Hannah, what he'd known of Thomas, what his brother had told him about the storm, correcting versions of the story that had gotten details wrong. Being very clear, in the careful way of a man who didn't usually spend his social capital, about what he thought the truth was. Clara Abbott came to the cabin 8 days after the storm. She was the one who'd looked at her shoes when Hannah had asked what talk was going around, and she came now with preserves she'd made herself and an expression that was somewhere between apology and something more complicated than apology, the face of a person who'd been living with a decision they didn't entirely like. She didn't produce a speech. She just held out the preserves and said, I could have done better. Not elaborating, not excusing it, just setting it down plainly the way you set down a weight you've been carrying. Hannah took the preserves. Yes, she said, you could have. Clara nodded. She seemed almost relieved, like she'd expected worse, and the plainness of Hannah's response was something she could actually deal with. They didn't become fast friends in that doorway. But Clara came again the following week, and the week after, and somewhere in there something started that was careful and real, and built on the fact that they both knew exactly what had happened and weren't pretending otherwise. The thing about Reverend Pruitt was that he was smarter than Roy Tesler and more committed than Dorothea Greaves, and he understood that the storm rescue had changed the narrative in ways he couldn't simply dismiss. So he did what smart men with damaged arguments do. He shifted the argument. He stopped talking about Hannah's character specifically, which had become harder to attack, and started talking about the principle of the thing, the structure, the example it set for the community's young women to see an unattached widow living with an unmarried man, regardless of the circumstances. Hannah heard about this version from Devin, who had good ears and spent most of his day behind a counter where people talked. She sat with it for a day and then she told Silas, who listened without expression. "He's going to keep finding new ground," she said. "He will." So the question of what this is, what we are, what this situation is, eventually it comes to that. Silas looked at her. She held his gaze because this was important, and she didn't want there to be any ambiguity about the fact that she understood what she was saying. "I'm not asking you for anything," she said. "I need you to know that first. I'm not presenting you with a problem that has only one solution. I have options now that I didn't have 2 months ago." Abel offered to speak to his cousin about the room above the trading post. "Margaret Henderson has mentioned space in her back house. I'm not without choices anymore." "But," he said. She thought about how to say the next part honestly. "But I stopped wanting to go," she said. "Somewhere in the last few weeks I stopped treating this as temporary, and I didn't exactly decide to. It just became true. And I think you should know that because it's not fair to you to be in that situation without knowing." The fire, the coffee, his hands around his cup in the way they went around his cup when he was thinking. "When did you stop wanting to go?" he said finally. She thought about it honestly. "The morning I figured out about the coffee," she said. "That you take it black." Something moved across his face that was more than the almost smile. Not quite a full smile either. His face seemed to approach that expression and then have second thoughts about it and settle somewhere in between, but it was something. It was the most something she'd seen from him. "That was week 1, he said. "I know," she said. "You waited 5 more weeks to say anything about it." "I wasn't sure what to do with it," she said. "I'm still not entirely sure. I'm done pretending it isn't there." He was quiet for long enough that she began to construct the response he might be building, and several of them were things she wouldn't want to hear, and she made herself sit with that possibility. Sit with the fact that she had said a true thing out loud, and now had no control over what happened to it. "I don't have a lot of practice at this," he said finally. "Neither do I," she said. "I was married for 12 years, and I still don't know how to do this part." "This part," he repeated. "The beginning part," she said, "when you're not sure yet what you have." He looked at the fire. "I took the chair by the door for the first 3 nights," he said, "after you got here, in case you needed to leave quickly, in case you woke up and realized you'd made a mistake and needed to go without ceremony." She had not known this. She thought about those nights, the sounds she hadn't recognized, what she'd interpreted as the cabin settling. "And after the 3 nights," she said, "I stopped thinking you were going to leave," he said. She absorbed that. It cost him something to say it, she could tell, not because it was too much, but because he was a man who dealt in small words, and this was more words than he usually spent. "I'm not going to leave," she said. "I know," he said, and then carefully, "I don't want you to." It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't poetry. It was 5 words from a man who weighed his words the way other men weighed gold, and she thought it was possibly the most valuable thing anyone had said to her since a Tuesday morning 2 years before Thomas got sick, when he'd come into the kitchen and put his hands on her shoulders and said nothing at all. Outside the window, the snow was still deep, but the quality of the light had changed. She'd noticed it that morning, the way the sun hit the white surface differently, more directly, as if it had shifted its angle just slightly toward warmth. It was still winter. It would be winter for weeks more. But the light knew something that the calendar didn't yet say. The reckoning with Pruitt came not through confrontation, but through accumulation, which was both anticlimactic and the only way it could have honestly worked. He gave a sermon on community standards the following Sunday that several people walked out of. Not dramatically, just quietly got up and left. Which is in some ways worse than drama, because it denies the speaker the dignity of an argument. Devin Marsh was one of them. Clara Abbott's husband was another. Roy Tesler, who had come a considerable way from the man who'd climbed the ridge with an implied physical threat, sat through the whole thing but went directly to Abel's house afterward, which said something about where his allegiances had landed. The conversation about Hannah's living situation didn't die. Pruitt wouldn't let it die. But it lost its fangs because the people who'd given it power had started making different calculations. Not all of them. The Reverend had loyalists and always would, but there was a shift in the weight of things, and once weight shifts, it doesn't usually shift back. Sheriff Aldous Burke came to the cabin on a Wednesday, 2 weeks after the storm. He was a careful man in his 60s who Hannah had seen a handful of times in town and formed no strong opinion of either way. He came alone, without ceremony, and he sat at the table when Silas offered him coffee, and he drank it and looked at the inside of the cup for a moment before he spoke. "I want to be straight with you both," he said. "Pruitt has made some formal inquiries about the nature of the living arrangement. He's framing it as a community welfare concern." Silas looked at him steadily. "I don't think it's a community welfare concern," Burke said. "I think it's a man who's used to deciding things about people who is currently unable to decide this particular thing. But I wanted you to know he's working that angle because you should have the information." "What happens if he pushes it formally?" Hannah asked. Burke looked at her. He had the eyes of someone who'd been watching people for decades and had stopped being surprised by most of what he saw. "Not much, honestly. There's no law being broken here. There's community standards, but community standards require the community to be in agreement. And from what I can observe, the community is—" He paused, finding the word divided, and dividing further. "In which direction?" Silas said. "In the direction of people who watched Abel Marsh's boy come home alive," Burke said. He set down his cup. "I grew up here. I've been sheriff for 21 years. I know what this town can be at its worst. I also know what it can be when it decides to be better." He looked at both of them, one and then the other. "I think it's deciding." After he left, Hannah stood at the window again. The window she'd been standing at the morning after the storm, when everything was white and remade. The snow was different now, lower, showing the dark edges of the woodpile. The line of the path Silas had cleared visible as a slight trough in the surface. "He didn't have to come tell us that," she said. "No," Silas said. "He came because he wanted to. She was working something out. Because he thought we should know. Because he decided we were worth—" She stopped. "Worth something," Silas said. "Yes." She turned from the window. He was at the table still, coffee cup in hand, and the late afternoon light came through the small window at an angle that hit the side of his face in a way that made him look— She didn't want to use the word she thought of. It was too large. She was still being careful with large things. That made him look like himself, fully and without apology, the way a person looks when they're exactly where they're supposed to be. She thought about Reverend Pruitt's formal inquiries and all the people out there still running their calculations, and the long, slow work of a community rearranging its understanding of two people who didn't fit its original picture. She thought, let them calculate. Let them take their time. She was warm, and she had work, and she had someone who had stopped taking the chair by the door after 3 nights because he'd stopped thinking she was going to leave. That was enough. That was more than enough. The fire needed another log. She got up and put one on, and the fire took it and built itself higher, and the cabin filled with the particular warmth of a well-fed fire in a well-made space on an afternoon that was cold outside and not cold in here, and she sat back down in her chair. Her chair, she'd stopped thinking of it as anything else around week 2, and she was still there, still here. Whatever came next, she was still here. The first real sign of spring came on a Thursday, which felt appropriate because nothing significant in Hannah's life seemed to happen on an impressive day of the week. She was splitting the last of the green birch. Her form had gotten good enough over the weeks that she could work for an hour without the axe head glancing, which had been her persistent early problem, that and grip. She'd had to rebuild the calluses on her right hand from scratch when she heard it. A drip. Coming from the south eave of the cabin where the ice had built up deepest through January. Just one drip, and then another, and she stopped mid-swing and stood there listening to the snow melt, which is a sound that doesn't announce itself, but once you hear it, you can't unhear it, a small persistent sound that means something large is changing. She put the axe down and looked up at the eave. The ice along the edge had a dark line running through it, a thin seam of water finding its way between the frozen surface and the wood underneath. It wasn't much. It was enough. She went inside and stood at the door. Silas was at the table working on the leather harness he'd been repairing for 3 days, the one the older dog had gotten into and partially destroyed with the cheerful destructiveness of an animal that didn't understand value. "The south eave is dripping," she said. He looked up. Something in his face changed. Not dramatically, just a slight settling, the expression of a man putting down a weight he'd been carrying through a very long winter. "About time," he said. It wasn't about time. It had been a hard winter, and they both knew it, and the fact that they'd come through it in one piece, 2 pieces, both upright, was not something either of them took casually. But she understood what he meant. Some seasons you just need to be done with. The days that followed the first drip were the in-between days, the muddy, uncertain time that isn't winter anymore but isn't spring yet either, when the snow pulls back from the south-facing slopes first and leaves the ground exposed and dark underneath, and everything smells like cold water and old leaves and something trying to happen. The path down the ridge turned to mud mid-morning and froze again at night, which made it passable but unpleasant, and the creek at the bottom of the eastern slope ran high and fast with snowmelt, carrying sticks and debris and making more noise than it had any right to. Hannah walked down to town for the first time in 6 weeks on a Tuesday in early March. She'd been going back and forth on it, not avoiding it exactly, but not seeking it either, waiting for whatever she was waiting for. She told herself she was waiting for the knee to be fully sound, which was partly true, but not the whole truth. The whole truth was closer to, she was waiting until she could walk into that town without needing anything from it, without her heart doing the thing where it braced for impact at every corner. On that Tuesday, she woke up, and the bracing wasn't there. She noticed its absence the way you notice when a headache finally lifts. Not the presence of something, but the absence of something that had been so constant you'd stopped registering it as separate from yourself. She told Silas she was going down. He looked at her once, reading whatever there was to read. "I'll come." "You don't have to." "I know," he said, getting his coat. They walked down together, which was a thing they hadn't done before. Come into town together, visible, not explaining anything, just 2 people walking the same path at the same pace in the mud of early spring. She was aware of what it would look like, and she found, descending the ridge, that she didn't care about what it would look like in the same way she'd cared 2 months ago. Not because the town's opinion had stopped mattering entirely. She wasn't built for that particular kind of freedom. Most people aren't. It's not weakness to want to be seen clearly by the people around you, but because she'd stopped needing their approval as a prerequisite for existing. That was different. That was the thing that had changed. Devin Marsh was the first person they encountered at the trading post, and he looked at them both, and something warm came into his face that wasn't quite a smile, but was the underlying material smiles are made from. "Hannah," he said, you look well." "I am well," she said. It was true. She was aware of it being true in a way she hadn't been for a long time. Not defiant true, not convincing herself true, just factually, quietly true. He sold her the provisions she'd come for, and while he was measuring out the flour, he said, without looking up, "Pruitt's been quieter lately." "I heard," she said. She had heard. Silas got information the way still water gets leaves, passively and without effort. Things just settled into him when he was in contact with the world. Roy Tesler had stopped attending Pruitt's additional meetings. 2 families who'd been among his more reliable supporters had started attending the smaller non-denominational gathering that met in the Abbott's front room on Sunday mornings. Not a mass defection, Not a dramatic falling away, just attrition. The slow leak of a position that couldn't be maintained against the evidence of what people had actually witnessed. He gave a sermon last week, Devon said, about forgiveness. He paused. Some people thought it was about you, asking the community to forgive you for whatever. He finally looked up. Other people thought it was a way of him trying to walk back from the position he's been in without admitting he'd taken it. Which do you think? Hannah asked. Devon considered this seriously. I think Pruitt is a man who's been the authority in this town for so long that he's forgotten how to be wrong, so he's found a way to be right even in retreating. He measured out the last of the flour. It doesn't really matter in the end. What matters is the retreating. She thought about that on the walk back up. She thought about whether it mattered, the way Pruitt managed his retreat, whether she needed him to admit it plainly, to stand in the street and say I was wrong about Hannah Whitlock in those exact words, whether anything short of that was enough. She decided it wasn't about enough. It was about what was real. And what was real was that Devon Marsh had looked at her with warmth instead of carefully managed neutrality. What was real was that Clara Abbott waved at her from across the street with the uncomplicated ease of someone who had decided where she stood. What was real was that Danny Marsh was alive and his father had stood up in that church and said something true at social cost to himself, and people had heard it. What Pruitt said about it in private was his own weight to carry. The confrontation she had been half expecting and half dreading for months came not from Pruitt directly, but from his wife, Meredith, who stopped her on the main street on the walk back. Silas had gone ahead to the hardware trader. She'd told him she'd catch up. And who stood in her path with the particular stillness of a woman who has made up her mind about something. Meredith Pruitt was 60 years old and had been married to Caleb Pruitt for 35 of them, and Hannah had always found her impossible to read. She was neither warm nor cold, always poised at the exact temperature of whatever the room required, a social skill that Hannah had once admired and now recognized as its own kind of loneliness. Mrs. Whitlock, she said. Mrs. Pruitt, Hannah said. There was a moment where they both stood on that muddy street in the thin March sunlight and assessed each other, and Hannah did not look away. I want to ask you something, Meredith said. You can choose not to answer. All right. Are you happy? She said it plainly without the social cushioning that usually surrounds that kind of question. Just, are you happy? Hannah was surprised enough that she had to take a second before responding. Yes, she said. I am. More than I expected to be. Meredith nodded slowly. She looked down the street in the direction Hannah had come from, toward the ridge that was visible from the edge of town, the tree line dark against the pale sky. My husband believes he was protecting this community, she said. I want you to know that I think he was also frightened of something he didn't have a category for. She paused. That doesn't excuse it. No, Hannah said. It doesn't. But I wanted to say it. Meredith looked back at her. Because frightened people do damage and usually nobody explains why. They just do the damage and then find the language for it afterward. She adjusted her gloves. You deserved better than you got. From this town and from my husband specifically. Hannah stood with that. She thought about all the ways she'd wanted acknowledgement over the past months, all the forms she'd imagined it taking, and she thought this was not any of those forms, but it was something realer than most of them. Thank you, she said, for saying that. Meredith nodded once, a contained gesture. The boy, she said, Danny Marsh. I've seen him in the street since the storm, running around like nothing happened. Something crossed her face that was either grief or relief, or possibly both. Children don't know how close they come sometimes. No, Hannah said. They don't. Meredith Pruitt walked away down the street, back straight, steps measured, carrying whatever she was carrying in the private way she carried everything. Hannah watched her go and thought that there are people in every story whose inner life you never fully see, people who do their suffering and their reckoning in rooms you're not in, and that Meredith Pruitt was probably one of them, and probably had been for a long time. She found Silas at the edge of the hardware traders, waiting for her without any appearance of impatience, just standing there with a coil of rope he'd bought and his face tilted slightly into the thin sun. "Meredith Pruitt stopped me," she said. He looked at her carefully. "She apologized," Hannah said, in her way. Not exactly an apology, but close. He processed this. "How do you feel about it?" She thought honestly. "Strange," she said. "Like when you've been holding your breath for so long that when you finally breathe in, you don't quite know what to do with the air." They walked back up the ridge together, and the mud pulled at their boots, and the sun was thin but real, and the creek ran loud and cold beside the lower path. And Hannah thought about breathing, about the specific project of learning to breathe normally again after a long time of holding it. It wasn't finished. She knew that. Nothing in life finished the way stories finished, with everything resolved and the air clear and everybody in their right place. Pruitt would still say things. There would still be people who held on to the old version of her because changing their minds felt like admitting something they didn't want to admit. The road back from being the subject of a town's worst impulses was not a short road, and it didn't go straight. But she was walking it, and she wasn't walking it alone. What happened next came from Silas, which she hadn't expected because he was not a man who initiated the large things. He managed the small things constantly and well, but the large things he tended to approach sideways, building up to them through a series of smaller movements that you didn't recognize as building until you looked back. She recognized it in retrospect. The extra shelf he'd added to the right side of the main room in late February, at a height that made sense for her specifically and not for him. The way he'd started saying we when discussing the cabin's winter preparations, not I, the wood we'll need, the route we should take, without making any announcement of the shift. The small notebook she'd seen him with one morning, open to a page that she'd only half glimpsed, which appeared to contain a rough sketch that looked like a floor plan but larger than the current cabin. She'd filed these things without commenting on them, the same way she'd filed the coffee 3 months ago, accumulating evidence of something she wasn't ready yet to name. It was a Sunday morning, the 3rd Sunday of March, when he said what he said. Not with ceremony, not with setup. Just said it the way he said things. She was sitting in her chair reading a book she'd borrowed from Clara Abbott, and he was at the table working on something with a piece of charcoal and a sheet of paper, and the fire was doing its job, and the older dog had been allowed inside on account of his age and was asleep at her feet in a condition of complete satisfaction, and she looked up for no particular reason and found him watching her. "I want to build onto the cabin," he said. She kept her face steady. "How much onto?" "Enough to be proper," he said. He looked at the paper in front of him. "Enough to be what it is." She understood what he was saying. He was saying it in the most Silas way possible, which was indirectly and practically and without any of the emotional declaration that would have made it easier to respond to. And she loved and mildly resented that about him in equal measure. "What is it?" she asked, gently, giving him the room to say it. He looked at her for a moment. She could see him doing the thing he did, measuring the words, finding the ones that were precisely right and no larger. "Home," he said. "For both of us, if you want it." She held that word in the air between them. Home. Such a plain word for such a large thing. Such a short word for everything she'd lost and rebuilt and been refused and fought for over the past 4 months. She thought about Thomas, which she still did and expected to keep doing, because loving someone for 12 years doesn't dissolve just because they're gone. It changes shape and finds a different place to live. And she'd learned to let it live without feeling like it was stealing something from now. Thomas would have liked Silas, she thought. He would have respected the way he built things to last, the way he said what he meant, and only what he meant, the economy of him. He would have been glad she wasn't alone. She thought about the $40 in the tin. She thought about Reverend Pruitt's hands on her table. She thought about flour in a bowl she'd never finished, and a Tuesday that had been a perfectly ordinary Tuesday. "Yes," she said, "I want it." He nodded once, the same contained gesture she'd seen Meredith Pruitt make on the street, and went back to the paper, and she went back to the book. And the fire went on, and the old dog snored at her feet, and outside the snow was retreating a little more every day, pulling back from the south-facing slopes, conceding the ground to the season that was coming. The building happened in April, when the ground was workable. Silas had thought it through over the winter in the way he thought through things. Thoroughly, quietly, with adjustments made for every variable he could identify. He knew how to build. She knew this about him in the abstract, and she knew it in the specific now. Watching him work through a week of mornings on the Eastern Addition, extending the cabin's footprint by a room that would serve initially as a proper bedroom, and eventually, if things went the way they were quietly moving, as whatever it needed to be. Abel Marsh came up to help with the heavy lifting for 2 days. He came without being asked. He just appeared on the first Wednesday of the project with his tools and his sleeves already rolled, and Silas looked at him for a moment and then handed him the other end of the beam, and they worked through the morning without many words, and Hannah made lunch for 3 people and brought it out, and the 3 of them ate sitting on a stack of lumber in the thin April sun. Devin came on the second Saturday. Roy Tesler came on a Sunday with his 2 sons, who were 14 and 16 and large for their ages, and contributed what large young men contribute to a building project, which is primarily the carrying of heavy things without complaint. She didn't say much to Tesler. He didn't say much to her. But he was there, which said the thing that neither of them apparently knew how to say directly, and she decided that was acceptable. People approach the bridge at different speeds. What matters is that they arrive. Clara Abbott came while the work was happening and sat with Hannah on the low wall near the cabin door and watched the men work and talked about things that had nothing to do with the past winter, ordinary things, garden things, the particular local wisdom about what to plant first in the valley soil. And Hannah thought, this is what it looks like when things get better. Not triumphant, not dramatic, just ordinary life resumed. The addition was finished in 3 weeks. It wasn't fancy. The windows were smaller than ideal because the glass had been expensive, and Silas had bought what he could afford in one trip, rather than stretching the budget and waiting for more. The floor had a slight lean to it on the south side that he was bothered by and that Hannah pointed out was barely perceptible and was certainly not going to ruin anything, and he said that he'd level it eventually, and she said that was fine, and she thought she'd probably hear about that floor for years and found she didn't mind. The cabin, extended, had a different quality to it, more itself somehow, like a sentence with the right word finally in it. Reverend Pruitt came to the cabin in the second week of April. She had not expected this. She'd been expecting maybe a letter, the formal kind, possibly with legal language about community standards and the church's interests, the kind of letter a man composes when he's lost the argument but hasn't accepted it yet. Not the man himself. Not on the door of the cabin. Silas answered it. She stood in the middle of the room and heard Pruitt's voice and went completely still, the way you go still when something you've been bracing for finally arrives. Reverend, Silas said, just that. Mr. Granger. A pause. I'd like to speak with Mrs. Whitlock, if she's willing. She thought about not being willing. She stood there for a full 10 seconds, genuinely considering it, and then she went to the door and stood beside Silas. Pruitt looked older than the last time she'd seen him, which had been through the window the day he'd stood in Silas's yard with his 2 hands folded and his moral authority on his sleeve. He was still a tall man, still carried himself with the particular posture of someone accustomed to being listened to, but something in the architecture of his face had shifted, like a wall that's been carrying more weight than it was built for, and has started to show it. Mrs. Whitlock, he said. She waited. He looked at her and she could see him trying to find the framing. The way Devin had said he found framings for things, the language that let him be right, even in retreating. She watched him look for it, and she watched him not find it. And she saw the moment he accepted that he wasn't going to find it, that there wasn't a version of this that let him hold on to what he'd been holding on to, and what was left underneath was just an old man who had done a thing he couldn't entirely explain and couldn't entirely take back. I acted in ways that were... He stopped, tried again. What I did, with the house, the way I went about it. You were a widow in the middle of grief, and I was efficient when I should have been. He stopped again. She thought, say it, just say the word. It's a small word. I was unkind, he said, and I was unkind after that, in the things I said and the things I allowed others to say. I want you to know that I know that. It wasn't a complete apology. It didn't address the months of gossip or the doors that didn't open or the specific particular cruelty of being told to make things easier for everyone while her husband was barely cold in the ground. It didn't give her back anything she'd lost. It didn't unsay the things that had been said. It was what he could do. She looked at him and understood that it was what he could do, and she thought about Meredith Pruitt on the street talking about frightened people and the damage they did. And she thought about Thomas saying that a woman ought to have her own emergency money, and he'd been right about so many things. She thought, I could make this harder than it has to be. I could hold him to everything, make him account for every particular damage, stand here and watch him try to find the words for things he doesn't have words for. I could do that. I would not be wrong to do that. But she also thought, I am building a room onto a cabin in the mountains, and there are men who came with their tools without being asked. And I have a chair by a fire that is mine, and a life that is mine. And Pruitt's reckoning with himself is his own work to do, and I do not have to hold it for him. I know you know it, she said, and I know it cost you to come up here and say it. She paused. I'm not going to tell you it's all right, because it wasn't. She held his gaze. But I'm not carrying it anymore. What you think of me or what I think of you, I've put that down. I'm not picking it back up. He looked at her for a long moment. He nodded once, slowly. The nod of a man absorbing something he hadn't expected but recognizes as true. He left without going inside. She watched him go down the path, and she checked herself honestly. She felt mostly nothing dramatic. Some sadness for the waste of it. Some residual anger that lived in the body and would probably take longer than a conversation to leave. And underneath that, something that was quiet and had space in it. Relief, maybe. The relief of setting down something heavy. She went back inside. Silas was at the stove, and he handed her coffee without a word, and she took it and stood at the window and drank it and looked at the south eave where the ice was completely gone now, the wood dark and clean and dry in the April light. You all right? He said. She thought about it honestly. Yes, she said. I think I actually am. The spring came in properly after that, the way it comes after a hard winter. Suddenly and without apology, like it was making up for lost time. The trees on the lower ridge leafed out in the space of what felt like a week. The creek went from raging meltwater to something more conversational, and the dogs started ranging further in the mornings, drunk on the smell of things waking up. Hannah put in a kitchen garden on the south side of the cabin, in the narrow strip of good light between the tree line and the wall, and she planted it with the particular attention of someone who intended to be there for the harvest. Intended to be there. That was the thing. She had stopped thinking in weeks and started thinking in seasons, which was its own kind of statement about what she expected from the future. She wrote to her sister in Kentucky. She hadn't written since Thomas died. The circumstances had been too complicated, too shameful in the way that being wrongly accused of things makes you feel the shame anyway, even when you know you shouldn't, and she'd gone quiet the way people go quiet when they don't know how to explain what's happening to them. She wrote now, 3 pages in her best hand, explaining everything plainly, without softening or embellishment. She described the winter, she described Silas, she described the storm and the boy, and the long, slow work of a community reconsidering its conclusions. She described the new room. She described waking up in the morning and knowing where she was. Her sister wrote back in 3 weeks, which was as fast as letters moved in that part of the country. A long letter full of the specific relief of someone who'd been worried from a distance without knowing how to help. She said she had thought something was very wrong when the letter stopped. She said she'd prayed. She said she was glad. She said she wanted to come in the fall to see this cabin and this man who Hannah had described with such careful understatement that her sister had apparently read right through it to what was actually there. Hannah read that last part twice and folded the letter and put it in the tin where the $40 used to be, which was now empty of money because she'd spent it over the winter in the small necessary ways that money gets spent, and she thought she would fill the tin with letters instead, and that seemed like a better use for it. On an evening in late May, when the light lasted long enough that they could sit outside after supper on the 2 log sections that served as rough seats near the cabin door, Silas told her the thing he hadn't told her. She hadn't asked for it. She'd made her peace early with not knowing, with the understanding that people offer their histories when they're ready and not before, and that demanding an accounting of someone's past is its own kind of trespass. But he told her, unprompted, into the long, late spring dusk, while the younger dog ran idiotic circles in the meadow grass below and the older one slept at his feet. He'd been married 12 years before, in a different state, a different life. His wife had died, not by illness, not by accident, but by her own choice, which was the specific loss you can't account for because it leaves no one to blame except everyone, including yourself. And he had blamed himself comprehensively and at length, and had eventually understood that the blame wasn't accurate, but it had left a mark that looked a lot like he wanted to be someplace where the mark wasn't visible to everyone who'd known him before. So he'd gone where nobody knew him. He'd built a cabin, and he'd settled into the quiet, and he'd learned how to be a person again, slowly. The way you learn a new language, first the basic structures, then the idiom, then one day you find yourself dreaming in it. She listened to all of it without moving. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, not because she didn't have anything to say, but because she wanted to say the right thing, and not just the first thing. She was lucky, she said finally, to have been loved by someone who still carries it that way. He looked at her. That's not a small thing, she said. The way you carry it, that's not a small thing at all. He looked back at the meadow, at the young dog doing its endless, meaningless loops. I stopped, he said, carrying it like a verdict. That took a while. I know, she said. They sat in the last of the light, and the swallows were out doing their evening work above the meadow, and the air smelled like warm grass and pine, and the specific smell of her garden which she was already possessive about in the way you get possessive about things you made with your own hands. This was not a perfect life. She was clear-headed enough to know that. There would be lean seasons and hard disagreements and days when the isolation of the mountain pressed down, and days when the town's long memory made itself felt in ways she'd have to handle without losing herself. Silas was a man with a complicated interior history, and she was a woman who was still, at some deep level, learning what she wanted now that the shape of her life had changed so completely. They would irritate each other. They would misread each other sometimes. They would have to keep choosing it, the way you have to keep choosing anything worth having. Not just once, in a dramatic moment, but in the small, ordinary choosing of every day. She knew all of this and was not afraid of it. The thing she'd learned across the worst months of her life was not that hardship makes you stronger, because that's too neat. That's the version people tell when they want difficulty to have a return on investment. The thing she'd actually learned was something quieter. It was this: that what a person is made of doesn't show in the easy times. It shows in who they are when every door is closed and the cold is real and they still have to decide what to do next. And what she'd found out about herself in those months was that she was the kind of person who knocked on doors even when she expected them not to open, who kept walking even with a bad knee on a ridge in a storm, who could sit across a fire from someone and not fill the silence with things that didn't need saying. She could live with that person. She was glad to know her. Silas got up after a while and went inside, and she heard him moving around in the way she knew by heart now, the particular sounds of him in the particular order of the evening. The stove, the water, the creak of the table when he leaned on it, checking something. Then she heard a sound she didn't recognize, a scraping. Furniture on the floor. She got up and looked through the doorway. He'd moved the second chair. He'd had it since she arrived, positioned at a slight angle. Not across from the first chair, not quite beside it, the uncertain geometry of two people who hadn't decided yet what they were to each other. He'd moved it now. It was beside hers, not touching, just beside. Facing the same direction, the same fire. He didn't say anything about it. He just sat down in his chair and reached for the piece of leather he'd been working on. A new project. She'd been watching it take shape for a week, but hadn't asked, and picked up the needle. She came inside and sat down in her chair. The fire was doing what the fire did. Outside, the last light was going out of the sky in the particular way it went in late spring, slowly and with a lot of color, taking its time. The younger dog came in from the meadow finally, done with its loops, and flopped down between the two chairs with the complete abandon of an animal that had run everything out of its system and was now ready for sleep. She looked at the two chairs, side by side, facing the same fire. She thought about the $40 in a tin. She thought about flour on her hands and a door held open in the dark. She thought about a man who'd moved a chair by the door for 3 nights and then stopped because he'd stopped thinking she was going to leave. She thought, this is what home is. Not the structure, not the walls. This, the fire, the chair, the person beside you who knows how you take your coffee, and who went into a storm because a child was out there, and who tells you the true thing without dressing it up, and who moved a chair not because it was a grand gesture, but because it was accurate, because it was what was true. And truth was the only language either of them had ever really trusted. She picked up her book. He worked the needle through the leather. The fire held. Outside in the mountains, spring was finishing what it had started, and the world was loud with the sound of things coming back to life. Not because they had to, not because someone had arranged it, but because that's what living things do when the conditions are right. They find the light and they grow toward it, quiet and stubborn and unremarkable in their persistence, until one day you look and something that was bare and frozen and looked like it was finished is full of green again, and you realize it was never finished. It was just waiting for the right season.